Today we have Sarah Hodge Weatherby. Her dad took her to her first Star Trek convention as a child, sealing her future as a card-carrying geek. By day, she's a librarian in Springfield, Mass., and her secret identity as a geek gal. She tours New England, lecturing on various aspects of geek culture. She's performed for all types of venues, from the Norman Rockwell Museum to Anime Boston, and her favorite creature is Mothman. And she takes her Earl Grey hot, and she hopes to retire in her very own hobbit hole someday. And I hope she invites us all.
Oh yes,
So
I will be cooking and having huge feasts. Come.
Well,
You have to be barefoot. That's the only catch.
If you need anything, I'm
Not
in
a
the back,
problem.
so if you need any help or...
Thank you so much. That was
Thank you.
so great. Hi everybody. Oh my gosh, so good to see you. I'm so flattered that everyone came out to see me tonight. God, it's the best time of the year, isn't it? I love this time of year. I joke that like my entire season of excitement starts on October 1st and it doesn't end until mid-January when I get to be in the Boar's Head Festival. So it's like a brilliant time. This is going to be the best thing. As said, when I'm not running around and doing these things, I am a librarian. I've been a librarian or a library worker since 2000, so I've been doing this for quite a while. And if you know anything about librarians, we love stories. That's one of the reasons we get into the work that we get into. We love sharing stories with people. And I was very fortunate to be a kid that grew up in the 80s and early 90s. So on top of the fact that, as I said earlier, my dad was a great storyteller and he would tell us these crazy things that happened to him in the 60s and, you know, in California, I was also fortunate enough to be the kid that got to grow up with things like In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. Does anyone remember this one? Oh, yeah. Okay, for those of you that might not, it's basically Mr. Spock tells you all about the Loch Ness Monster. It's fantastic. Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. That was also a staple in our household. That theme music still creeps me out. Every week, Robert Stack. This is Robert Stack, and we're going to talk about some stuff that's going to give you a nightmare for the next 10 years. You know, this kind of thing. I was an X-Files fan. You know, I love this stuff. I read The Mothman Prophecies and Whitley Strieber's Communion far too young and was entirely convinced that Mothman was going to come get me, and if it wasn't him, it was going to be the Greys. So, I had a wonderful childhood is what I'm saying. I was the kid that showed up to the library to ask for all this weird stuff. I did not understand why the librarians in Springfield called me Wednesday until many, many years later. It is now my favorite nickname. But I have never lost my love for this stuff. And one of the reasons I love all of the weird, creepy things that we're going to talk about tonight is that the stories are fantastic. You can believe that this stuff is entirely real. You can be entirely skeptical and be like, I don't think any of this stuff actually happened. You can be like me and be somewhere in between. I have different opinions on different cases. But no matter which end of anything you're on, you have to admit the stories themselves are great. They make for great entertainment. So for tonight, mostly, I am not going to tell you that anything you see here tonight is real. I am not going to tell you that anything you see here tonight is not real. That is entirely up to you. I highly recommend at the end, check out my bibliography, get the material that I got in order to do this research, get other material, read all about it, make up your own mind. But for tonight, I want you to sit back. I want you to get into the Halloween spirit. And I want you to enjoy the stories that I'm going to share, because our state is really, really, really weird. And I think you're going to like what I have to show. Now, I would also add that I had to limit this to some of my favorite stories, because trying to tell all of the good stories in Massachusetts is like 9 panels. So this is just a taste. I highly recommend, again, follow up on this. You're going to find other stories I didn't get a chance to touch on, and I promise you it's worth the journey. So when I put this together, I decided that what we would do is we would kind of put each section in a little box. And that's just to kind of help people get a feel for what we're talking about at the time. Now, this is tricky because, in all honesty, a lot of these things don't fit into a really comfortable box. You may have a story that starts sounding like it's a haunting and turns into an alien abduction. We'll get to that one in a little while. But just for kind of use of everyone, we're going to stick with it, as if each one kind of fits into these little boxes. And the first box that I want to talk about, I'm going to put a kind of a very handy handle on it. The first box is cryptozoology. Now, cryptozoology, as the slide says, is a term that refers to looking for creatures or animals that mainstream science is like, nah, these things don't exist. Now, if you go to Springfield College and you're like, hello, I would like to go to the continuing ed program and I would like to study cryptozoology, they're going to look at you like you have 9 heads. It's not an actual recognized branch of science. But it's a great word to describe a lot of stuff that doesn't really fit into any of these other boxes. So this is where we're going to start. And if you're going to talk about cryptozoology, you have to start with the granddaddy of all of them. This is a being that we both love, sometimes as our friendly forest friend. Sometimes we fear him and all the found footage movies where he rips teenagers apart and leaves blood splattered all over the camera. And sometimes he's just a mystery. We don't know what his motivation are or what he is. And that, of course, is Bigfoot. America loves Bigfoot, Sasquatch in some areas. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that most people think when you start talking about Bigfoot, they're thinking Northern California, sort of the Patterson-Gimli film from back in the 60s. They're thinking of Oregon or Washington State or Canada, or if we're still talking the US, Alaska. But what a lot of people don't realize is that there are Bigfoot sightings on record in every single state in America. In fact, some states have great nicknames for him. My personal favorite is the Bigfoot that keeps getting seen in the swamps in Florida. They call it the skunk ape because apparently it smells like Pepe Le Pew, and I just find that very charming. We have sightings across the middle of the country where they were either referred to them as grassmen or they refer to them as sheep squatch because they like to steal sheep. Massachusetts is no exception. We have a long history of these strange guys being seen all over our state. And you'd be surprised, A, it's still happening up until this time, and B, you might be surprised some of the areas people are still claiming to see it. Greenfield, Massachusetts, Amherst, Massachusetts, Mount Tom. Now again, this is what people are claiming. I'm not saying one way or the other. That's okay, that's fine. But this is just what's on record, that's all. So you take it as it is. I want to talk about a couple of areas that a lot of these reports seem to be coming out of and talk about a couple of the reports that are kind of some of the more famous stuff. And those stories are pretty fun. Okay.
And that last slide, was that a foot?
Oh, yes. So obviously the first one is a statue, but that is actually, this is great. I will tell that this is a cast that was made that we are almost 100%, I shouldn't say 100%, 99.9% positive is probably a hoax. These were found very similarly along a riverbed up in sort of the north end, sort of northwest end of Massachusetts. And the way they look is very similar to a hoax that was perpetuated right here in the Pioneer Valley. Back in the 70s, we had a set of Bigfoot, quote unquote, footprints that were found along the river in Agawam. And much later on, the people that did it realized the joke got out of hand, came forward and showed what they were wearing in order to do it. But it does give a good illustration of what people kind of expect to see. So this is, now again, it's never been proven. No one's come forward and said, yes, we did this. But a lot of the evidence, the way it was sort of balanced, it's probably a hoax. But it's still a good illustration of what people expect to see when they're looking for this kind of stuff. Okay. So there's 3 main areas that we see the most reports coming out of. The area around the Bridgewater and sort of the towns up there, particularly in the Hockomock Swamp, we get a lot of reports coming out of there. Now, there's a guy in the late 70s, early 80s, we're going to talk about him again a little bit later. His name is Lord Coleman. He starts off as a newspaper reporter and then graduates into writing a whole bunch of books about weird things from all over New England. And so he's the one that kind of starts calling this area the Bridgewater Triangle. We're not going to get heavily into that. Mostly it's because obviously in the late 70s, the Bermuda Triangle was a big thing. Everybody liked to read up on that. So he's probably echoing that. But Bridgewater is really interesting because that entire area has a huge amount of reports of various things coming out of it. Everything from Bigfoot in the Hockomock Swamp area to UFO sightings to giant birds, believe it or not, like 12-foot wingspan type stuff. So it's really kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different things supposedly going on there. We also have what's often referred to as the Cobble Mountain Critter. There's a couple other names that they attach to this one. People report report seeing this particular thing in the Westfield-Russell area or in the Cobble Mountain Reservoir area, a lot of sort of the way between Route 20. And then the Berkshires Bigfoot, which is often seen in the Pittsfield area in several different towns, particularly around October Mountain State Forest. That's a big one. Now, I will note that if you do a little research on this, particularly before about the mid-90s, when you're looking into the Berkshires Bigfoot, you might find some reports drifting around from older newspaper reports that call him the Coca-Cola monster, which that's exactly the reaction I had when I first saw that. I was like, wait, what? The Coca-Cola monster? I have to say, my imagination made it much more fun than it actually is. In my head, I could see like this Christmas commercial with the snow coming down and Bigfoot's got his little Santa hat on and Santa's next to him and they clink Coca-Cola bottles and Bigfoot looks at the camera and says, Bigfoot like Coca-Cola and Santa, and then takes a big drink and then it's Coca-Cola. By the way, if anyone knows anyone that works for Coke, tell them to call me. I'll give them the idea. It's not that much fun. So what it really is back at the turn of the last century, Coca-Cola paid several towns in that area to go in and paint these big murals of their logo on cliff sides and big rocks and kind of, it was an advertising scheme. Many, many years after that, these paintings lasted for a really long time. They were made to last. Eventually, they do fade away. I don't believe any of them are left, but most of them lasted till at least the early 90s. And these also happen to be in fairly wilderness areas that people go hiking and things in, and that's where they claim that they see these things. So it was referred to that simply because of those murals. Still, it's kind of a fun way of putting it though, right? Like I love that imagery. It's really great. All right, I want to talk about a couple of the more famous sightings around the state and some of the weird stuff that people claim around them. So we have a guy in the Bridgewater area, Joseph DeAndre, and he was a writer very much in the same vein as Lauren Coleman, who wrote about this kind of stuff, who went into the swamp specifically looking for Bigfoot. So here's a guy that's kind of already looking for this kind of stuff. And he talks about a report on April 8th, 1970, where a couple of cops in this Hockomock Swamp area are sort of pulled over. There's areas around the swamp that you can kind of pull into a small parking lot and kind of overlook some of the scenic area or overlook parts of the swamp. They had pulled in. It was kind of not dark, but getting really dusky. They were just kind of catching up with some of their paperwork and talking and probably having a couple cups of coffee, I would imagine. And then in the middle of all of this, something or somebody grabbed the back of their cruiser, lifted it up about a foot, and then dropped it again. Scared the heck out of both of these cops. They claimed that they turned the car around in the driveway as fast as they could and put their floodlights on. When the lights came on, they saw something big and dark in a silhouette, broad shoulders, very, very tall. It was so fast they didn't really get an estimate on how tall, they just said it was really big, apparently running off into the tree line and disappearing into the swamp. This was sort of like the big story that came out at the time. But there's lots of different stories that come out of that area. My personal favorite is one that I read a while back about a fisherman in the late 80s that was doing some fishing in the swamp. He was in a canoe. He's kind of drifting around with his line out. He said he was having a terrible time, not catching anything. And then as it was getting later in the day and he was starting to get ready to pack everything up, this very large, hairy, again, broad shoulders. He said he was estimating it at about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. It had about a foot on him, and he was about 5'8", 5'9". So he says this thing comes out of the brush, steps into the swamp, crosses in front of his canoe about 50 feet, looks him over real quick, like, what are you doing here? And then almost to the other shore, looks back at him, leans down, puts his hand or paw into the water, pulls a big fish out, takes a big bite out of it, like, okay, dude, whatever, and walks away. And the guy's like, I'm done, I'm out. I can't catch a fish, and I don't know what that was. I'm out of here. You can have the fish, it's fine. So who knows? Again, people make these reports. I want to move to the I want to move to the Berkshires Bigfoot for a couple of minutes because there's a couple of really interesting, what's that?
Probably someone just from our family.
It's possible, I don't know. So in the Berkshires, we have a case in 1983 This gentleman, Eric Durant, he's out camping with a group of his friends on Felton Lake in Washington, Massachusetts. And he starts hearing weird noises. Like, it gets dark, they've got their camp set up, they're sitting around. And at first, all it is the sound of like a big animal or maybe a large person sort of moving around the underbrush and the trees around their camp. And at first, they're nervous, but not because they think it's a monster, they think it's a bear. And they're like, oh boy, this is not something we need to deal with. This thing's obviously checking out some of the food we have here. So they get their flashlights out and they start kind of shining it around the side of the campground, hoping to kind of scare it away. But they don't see anything. Then Eric says about 15 to 20 minutes after hearing this kind of rustling for the first time, and he also notes, I should say, that all of this happens about an hour, and it kind of comes and goes. So they hear rustling for a while, and then it calms down, and they think maybe it's gone, and then it starts up again. Then they hear from several different points back in the woods around the campground, whoop, 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 whoop. The guys are like, what the hell is that? So again, they get up, they shine flashlights around, they can't see anything. That, again, in and out for about the next 20 to 30 minutes, and they're still hearing them moving around at the same time. Then, about 40 minutes into all of this, they start hearing what appears to be someone picking up large pieces of wood or sticks and smacking them against another large piece of wood. They were guessing trees or maybe large logs in the area. So they're getting all three of these effects, and finally, an hour after kind of walking around, staying near the fire but shining flashlights, trying to figure out what they want to do, they decide they've had enough. Either something weird's out there, or people from town have come up to mess with them, and either way, they don't want to mess with this. So they pack up their stuff, they throw it in the back of the truck, they put the fire out, and then they all get into the truck and start heading out of the campground. Now, Eric says about half a mile up the road as they're heading out, something comes out of the brush in front of the truck. It's not close enough that the headlights illuminate it completely. It's kind of on the edge of the headlights, but they get a look at it as it comes across the road. He describes it as being very broad shoulders. At first, they think it's wearing one of those 1970s style fringe jackets, and then when it turns, they realize that those fringes are everywhere, so it's not fringe, it's hair. It's fairly long hair, actually. It's big enough that it only takes a couple of, 3 or 4 strides to get across this big dirt road that they're going down. But they never get a really clear look at it. They also make a basic estimation based on the top of the truck and how big it seemed to be, that they think it was about 7 feet tall. It goes across the road into the brush on the other side. Eric's like, we're putting a little pedal to the metal, we're out of here. And a second later, one of his friends that's in the back of the truck smacks on the back of his seat and goes, go, 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 go. So he puts it even more, and they get out of there. And once they're kind of out of the area and back in civilization, one of his friends that was there says he looked over as it crossed into there to make sure that it was keeping going, and he could only see the silhouette, but it clearly had stopped just among the tree line, and he thought it had turned around to watch them go by, and he was nervous whatever it was going to get aggressive if they didn't get out of there. So Eric gets nervous. This is a big thing. Now, to be fair, whatever this was doesn't appear to have been particularly hostile, but they're still nervous about it. So they make a report to the police department the next morning because they're like, if it's dangerous, we want you to know. And then eventually the Berkshire Eagle finds out about it, sits him down and interviews him. Not surprising, the Berkshire Eagle actually has quite a bit of this stuff, especially up until the early 90s. They really seem to be interested in these stories. There's also a report on October Mountain in the state forest. This is roughly about 6 years later, but same basic area of Massachusetts. This gentleman's name is Frederick Parks, and he is taking a hike on this mountain. He gets up towards the top of the mountain. He said it was in the middle of the summer, sort of July, maybe late June, and it's that time of year where you have a lot of daylight to work with. It's not really going to start getting dark until 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So he gets up. He has plenty of time to get back down again, but he said by the time he got to the top, it was just getting to that, it's starting to get a little red, a little, you can tell that the light's getting a little long and it's time to head back to the car. So he's about to turn around and head back when, as he's walking, he realizes to his left-hand side that he can see that there's a small clearing sort of through the trees. He said roughly about 50 to maybe 100 feet over to that side. And he can't see it really well because there's a lot of trees in between. But he can see that at first, he thinks he sees a bear. It looks like it's walking around this clearing, but he realizes a couple of things that kind of make him go, Number one is the shape of it, while kind of bear-like, struck him as something wrong. It just didn't quite match what he should have in his head. The second thing he notices is that it's walking around on two legs. Now, bears can absolutely do that. In fact, they stand on two legs quite a bit, and they can walk on two legs. They often will for short distances. But in general, unless there's something wrong with that bear, they don't particularly like to walk on two legs. They're going to go back down on four to be more comfortable. Now, we have a perfect example a few years back of some film. There are bears that, in fact, because of injuries or other things, completely walk on two legs all the time. But it's just not very common. So to him, this seems really strange. And of course, he's a seasoned hiker. He's got all his stuff with him. So he gets out his little trail binoculars, puts them up to his face, and gets a look. And he says from that point on, he knew absolutely he wasn't looking at a bear. He talks about this thing as being, again, very tall. He wasn't sure exactly how tall. He's guessing about 6 feet to 6.5 feet. Very, very broad-shouldered, long, dark hair all over it. He said that it seemed like it had a reddish tint to it, but he wasn't positive if the hair itself had a reddish tint or if what he was seeing was the longer light kind of reflected in the fur or hair or whatever it was. So he kind of left that open to what it might be. He talks about the fact that as soon as he gets a clear look at it, it is absolutely holding arms, paws, whatever that is, down by the sides rather in the front, like a bear would standing on two legs. Walking all over this clearing, and as he watches it, he realizes that as it's coming around, it is occasionally leaning down, grabbing onto something. He's seeing big rocks, big sticks, small logs, and moving it over to one side, and then leaning back down and going through the ground and picking stuff out and putting it in its mouth. And he realizes that whatever this is, it's picking up insects and grubs from underneath all of this kind of, stuff around. As any gardener knows, you pick up a rock, there's a million bugs under there, right? So, Frederick is kind of fascinated, but he's also a little scared. He doesn't know what this is. He said that when it turned and kind of walked, he didn't get a great look at the face, because again, even with the binoculars, he's kind of far back. But he said there was no muzzle. It was definitely a flat face, like a human face. And he did see a little bit of a glitter in it that suggested eyes where, you'd expect them to be. But even with the binoculars, he didn't get a great look at that part. He also notes something that we'll talk about in just a second that's pretty interesting. But at this point, he's sort of like, he watches it for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then he's like, you know what? This thing, again, it hasn't been aggressive, but I think we're gonna get out of here just in case. He quietly walks away, and as soon as he feels like he's far enough, he goes down the mountain as fast as he can. Said he didn't run, but he walked real fast, gets back in the car, and again, the next day, makes a report to the police department specifically saying, this thing might be perfectly harmless, but I want you to know something weird is up there because I don't want someone to get hurt. Berkshire Eagle picks it up and interviews him about 3 or 4 days later. Now, he mentions in his report something really interesting. He says that while he's watching this thing walk around the clearing, at one point, it turns to grab a rock and he gets it in profile for a second. And in profile, it has a very slightly elongated head. He said the end was rounded, not pointed, but it's like kind of almost like a pulled back head. In 1989, there's a cultural phenomenon that's been around for a little while that's still kind of popular. For some of us that like a good classic comedy series, SNL was known for their Conehead sketches. And in 1989, that was still kind of part of the lexicon, good Lord. You knew what I meant. Thank you. You're very kind.
No, I'm not.
So when he's doing this report, he says, I'm not saying that they were that big or pointed or exaggerated, but it made him think of the Coneheads in a much more realistic way. This is kind of important because we have a report roughly about 10 years later in 1998. Now this is coming from the Cobble Mountain area. This is actually at a campground in a place called Granville. And this is Prospect Mountain Campground. And this group of young college students are all up there having themselves, and funny enough, it's very much like what happened to Eric. They go up, they make themselves a camp. They've got a fire going. Everything's looking great. It's about 10 o'clock at night. It's pretty dark. And one of the students realizes sometimes when you go camping and there's no convenient porta potties nearby, that she has to take care of some of that business and decides she's going to go off into the trees a little bit away from her friends to take care of that. So she identifies herself as Abby Benton. Abby gets up, walks out of the area that they're camping in, gets a little bit further back in the trees, and she describes it as getting far enough back so that her friends can't see her, but she can still more or less see the firelight through the trees because she doesn't want to get lost. She does what she needs to do and then stands up and starts to kind of get herself together in order to go back into camp. And that's when the bush that's roughly about 25 to 30 feet to her left stands up and looks at her. This thing is absolutely, I know, thank goodness she already went because I'm sure it would have been a disaster. This thing is covered in hair. Again, she says it's not super easy to see because there is some light, but firelight, especially coming through trees, is not really great light. There's a little bit of a moon, but there's tree covering. This is in the late fall. There's this sort of in the middle of October, so they do have a little bit of, some of the leaves have come down, so there's a little more light than normal. But she basically mostly sees this in silhouette. However, she does see a couple of things as it sort of starts to move around. One thing is that she gets the impression of the hair being very, very dark, probably brown, maybe black. But again, for a second, sort of sees it reflected as having a little bit of a red tint to it. She herself says the same thing. I don't know that it was red tinted or that that was the firelight that was coming through the trees, but it seemed to have a red coloring to it. She also talks about the fact that it clearly did not have a muzzle, that we're talking about a flat face. She talks about it being about a foot taller than her, so she's about 5'7". She said it might have even been taller than that, but it was a little hard to tell. She kind of makes a judgment based on some of the lower tree branches, but again, not an exact measurement. And she said the interesting thing was just for a split second as it turned and sort of looked at her, in that light, she kind of sees white of the eyes for a second because its eyes are huge. And she realizes, she says, that whoever this is, they are just as scared of her as she is of them. They were not expecting this. So they make eye contact for a second. This person, creature, whatever, turns to one side and walks off into the woods, doesn't want any part of this. And Abby absolutely hits the ceiling, runs back into camp, absolutely hysterical, get our stuff, we are out of here, and does not tell her friends what she saw until they're back in Westfield. Absolutely panics. Now, she says two other things that I find interesting. One is much later on when she was calmer and she thought about it, she got the impression, especially because it seemed so scared, that maybe what it was doing was kind of crouching down in the brush, being hidden, and watching them to make sure that they weren't a threat. The other thing is when it turns to walk away, she says that she got a good look at the back of the head in silhouette, and again, it's this elongated, slightly rounded head shape. In fact, in 1998, there is a revival of the Coneheads. Chris Farley does a movie version of it a few years before this, and she makes a comparison to the same thing. She's like, it reminded me of that Chris Farley movie. Again, not as exaggerated. So, who knows? This is really interesting. Now, as far as we know, she's not much of a Bigfoot enthusiast, so we don't know that she ever saw Frederick Park's testimony, and I will say that it's not easy to find. You got to be one of those people that spends an hour online looking up stuff for a workshop. But it's not impossible. She might have found it and read it and decided she wanted to tell a story. But there's a lot of details here that I find really interesting, and especially because there is a theory amongst folks in the valley that believe that this is an absolute real thing or group of things, that the Cobble Mountain Critter and the Berkshire's Bigfoot may in fact be the same group. If you look at a map between the areas of these two areas, there's a lot of houses, there's civilization, but a lot of that area is heavily wooded, and even when it is houses, they're very spread out. It's a lot of farmland, it's a lot of, isolated sort of country housing. You're not going to find a lot of big cities in between there. So it's possible for a large animal to move in between those areas over the miles. We really don't know. And that's where we're going to leave it. Now, the next cryptid that I want to tell you about is my personal favorite. Bigfoot, we find Bigfoot stories all over America, but this little guy is Massachusetts born and bred. I like to refer to him as Massachusetts' own Mothman, because West Virginia loves to talk about how cool that cryptid is. But this little guy comes along, a very weird thing in 1977. Now, in 1977, two strange things come to Massachusetts. In September of 1977, hello, I come along. In April of 1977, the very thing that I like to think of as my crypto zodiac, the Dover Demon shows up. And Dover is seen in Dover, Massachusetts, which, by the way, I'm just going to add, I spoke there last night, which was very interesting, let me tell you. It is seen over April 21st and 22nd of 1977. Now, I'm going to add this in. I did not get details about this because I have a little bit of issue with this. There is a person that claims they saw this multiple years before this in 1972. But none of this story comes out until years after Bill, John, and Abby make their sighting and make their reports. So I'm not saying that it's impossible, and I'm not saying that that person isn't telling the truth, but I am saying it's a little odd that you don't hear anything about it until like 20 years after these reports were made. So I'm going to leave that to one side because there's a lot of controversy about whether that's an accurate report or not. But I'm mentioning it because you absolutely can look this up and have a look at it for yourself. What we do know, what is in fact on record, is that we have three groups of people that claim to see this thing in Dover. One is on the very first night, April 21st. Now, all of this is happening during the local school's April vacation. So the high school is shut down for the week. William Bartlett, Mike Manzocco, and Andy Brody, all friends from the same high school. William's about 17, Mike is 15, and Andy is nearly 16. They're all in a car, they're driving around Dover, they're doing what kids do in 1977. I think most of the faces here know this, but just in case. Back in the days where there was no internet, there were no streaming services, there was no gaming consoles unless you were really wealthy and had an Atari, and most people didn't even have a VCR. So there's not a lot to do as a teenager in Dover. There's honestly not a lot to do as a teenager in Dover today, but definitely not back then. So what you would do is you get together with your buddies, you borrow your dad's car, you stick an 8-track of Queen's Best in there, run the windows down, and drive around town, maybe hit up for some pizza. That's at least what's going on in my head. So anyway, these three boys, that's exactly what they're doing. They're cruising around, they're having themselves a good time. Andy's sitting in the passenger seat next to Bill. Mike is in the back seat right behind Andy. So when the sighting actually happens, Andy has turned around and is having a conversation with Mike, so he's not watching the road. So when this happens, Bill is the only one that gets a clear look at this thing. And it basically happens as they're driving. Now, I do want to point out very quickly, before we get to the meat of the story, I took these photos on Farm Street in Dover in 2013. To demonstrate two major things. And I can tell you, after I left the lecture last night, I drove this exact same street in the dark because I'm just that kind of gal. I wanted to see if I saw anything interesting. And it pretty much looks the same way. That's very little has changed since I took these photos. There's two things that you notice in this particular part of town. Number one is it's very, very dark. There are some street lights, but almost everything you're going to see is either by headlights or by moonlight, if you're lucky enough that it's a full moon. Even without the street lights, many of the houses are set back from the road. In fact, a lot of them are set way back. They were farmhouses originally, and even some of them are still farmhouses. There's big pieces of land in front of them. So you're not getting a lot of light from the actual houses. It's almost entirely street or headlight lit. The other thing is that Dover loves its stone walls. There's stone walls everywhere. They're kind of gorgeous, actually. Some of them are original colonial walls. Some of them are rebuilt or remodeled in that style, but they're much more new. But all of the town, especially in the Farm Street area, these things are everywhere. And this becomes important when we have the actual report. So let's go back to Dover. Will is driving on Farm Street. His two friends are chatting, with both kind of paying attention to each other. And William says, as he's kind of coming up one of the areas of Farm Street, some of the darkest areas, I might add, he can kind of see there's something on the side of the road way ahead of the car. It's a tree and a rock wall, but something is up on this rock wall. So he turns his brights on to get a better look at it, because at first he's like, it's some kind of an animal, but I want to see what it's doing, because if it suddenly darts in the road, I want to know. I want to be able to stop. Instead of seeing any animal that he can possibly think of, this is what he sees. He says that by his own estimation, it's roughly about 2 to 2.5 feet tall. Again, he's judging it by how high the wall actually is. He clearly states that he sees these sort of hands and feet, both that are gripping onto these rocks. In fact, he compares them to the way a monkey or a primate's hands and feet would work. He talks about it being extremely pale. It's sort of this gray-white color, but it has a little bit of a pink overtone to it. He says as the car lights kind of go over the back and the skin, he thinks that there's a roughness to it. It seems like it has a texture. When he makes the original report, he compares it to shark skin. This very unusually huge head with very kind of an odd shape, very bulbous. He mentions the fact that even within the few seconds he saw it, he immediately thought that can't be right because that neck is tiny. How is it holding the head up? And no features on the face at all. No nose that he could see, no mouth that he could see, but these giant orange eyes that are glowing in the dark as they go by. Now, he later says he's not sure if they were glowing in the first place or that they were reflecting light back from the headlights like a deer or any other animal would be. And at this point, Bill does what I think most of us would do, right? He yells. And he yells something I probably can't repeat in a library, so I'm going to leave that up to your imagination. Andy and Mike whip their heads around to try to find out why he's freaking out. They don't really see much of it. They basically see the back end of it as it kind of goes over this wall. So they get a glimpse of something small and pale, but that's basically it. On the edge of the light, though, they all see that it stands up and runs off into the dark. Again, now it's kind of a silhouette. And they said that it definitely ran on 2 legs and that it kind of had this weird kind of hoppy gait to it that they almost compared to like a cartoon character. And that's it. That's what they see. Again, Bill has no idea what he's looking at. He freaks out. The next day, he goes to the police with his parents because he doesn't know what else to do, makes a report about this, and because Bill, who still is, by the way, an excellent artist, he makes this sketch that you see. This is the original sketch. The painting was made based off of it. Now, this is just a detail, but I love this. This just strikes me as so... I don't know what this kid saw. I'm not even going to claim any... This could have been a baby moose. Who knows? But I do think they saw something that scared the hell out of him, mostly because he writes on the side here, I, Bill Bartlett, swear on a stack of Bibles that I did see this creature, Bill Bartlett. That is so charming. That's such a 17-year-old kid thing to do. It's gorgeous. So our second witness, John Baxter, funny enough, John's leaving his house roughly around the time the boys claim that they see this. John's 15. He's leaving to go over to his girlfriend's house and hang out for a little while. He hitchhikes for part of the journey. By the way, kids, they didn't know what a serial killer was in '77. Don't do that. But he hitchhikes away to get there. He hangs out with his girlfriend for a couple of hours. I'm going to assume they played Parcheesi all night. And then he just, I got to go home. If I'm too late, my parents will get mad. So he starts to head home. Gets onto one of the streets that are adjacent to Farm Street, near one of them that's Farm Street, Springdale Avenue, and I did forget to actually make the notation of the exact street that he was on, but I looked on it on a map, so it's basically Farm Street, Springdale, and then the one he was on kind of does this and eventually hooks up with Farm down here. So it's almost like a triangle, weirdly enough. So anyway, he's heading home, he cuts through a couple of fields, gets onto this street, starts to walk, and he's looking for lights to put a thumb out. And then he realizes that he can see a person, he thinks, further up the street. They're on the side of the sidewalk, they're leaning up against a tree, they've got one hand kind of gripping onto it, and the impression he gets is that this person's not doing great. They're leaning really heavily on this tree, this little like side tree on the green belt. The other thing is that they're really small. Like he kind of gets freaked out with how small they are because it's almost midnight and he's sort of like, that looks like a little kid. That little kid shouldn't be out this late. He also realizes that the shape is not quite right, but he thinks he might recognize it. There's a boy in town that everybody kind of likes, but he has a genetic disorder that has done various things to him, but has also made his head a little bit bigger and more bulbous than most people's. He thinks this might be the kid, and he's worried about him. So he calls out his name, which everyone calls him MG. So he's, MG, what's going on? And whoever this is doesn't react at all. So he realizes it's not his friend. He starts getting closer and closer, slowly, slowly. As he gets closer, it straightens up. It's still holding onto the tree, but now it's standing up almost stiff. He said he got the impression it was scared. And as he gets closer, he gets roughly about 15 feet. And I like to think of this, he doesn't really explain. He says he gets a better look at it, but in my head, it's a little bit like a horror movie. You know, the clouds part and the moonshine comes down and suddenly. Now, the interesting thing, too, is once he realizes what he's looking at, he also mentions that the eyes are glowing, not brightly, but a little bit. Now, we don't know if this, again, is a natural phenomenon or if it's maybe reflecting some of the moonlight back at him. But he sees that it is small, it is pale, he cannot make out a face other than these glowing eyes. He doesn't get quite as much detail as Bill Bartlett, maybe because Bill had full headlights on this thing and this boy doesn't. But anyway, he can tell right away that this is not what he thought it was. He's very nervous. And this little thing basically lets go of the tree and scrambles across the street into the underbrush and heads for the trees on the side of the road. And then John does something that I wouldn't do for every stack of money you could possibly throw in front of me. He's scared, but he's curious. He chases after this thing. Now, he doesn't chase it for very long. He said it was only for a couple of, maybe a minute or so. But once it gets to the tree line and starts heading through, he gets the best look at it so far and decides, okay, you know what? No, I don't like this. I'm going to go home. So he backs off. He starts to leave. He glances over his shoulder to see that it's standing there on the tree line, but it's watching him go as if to make sure that he's going to leave it alone. And then it disappears, he gets back on the street. He manages to hitchhike home, gets into his house a little bit after midnight, and then does something that, again, makes me think, I don't know what this is, but I think this kid saw something that scared the hell out of him. And that is, he wakes his parents up at 12:30 in the morning and tells them that he saw something scary and he wants to go to the cops the next day. He's completely freaked out. So whatever it was, I think he really honestly saw something that scared him. Now, our last person is actually the next night. So after these two boys show up, he also does a sketch, not quite as detailed, but pretty detailed. They go to the police the next morning. These two boys make the report. They send a couple of cruisers out to the area. They look around. They find nothing. There's no footprints. There's nothing out there. The second night, on the 22nd, we only have one person that saw this. And that's a young lady named Abby Brambham. And Abby goes to a party with her boyfriend, Will Tanier. Will's about 18 and Abby's 16 at the time. They go to this party and they're heading home. He's bringing her back home. And they're on Springdale Ave. So that's that street, that's the main street that these other two kind of connect up with. As they're driving, Will makes a turn around a corner on Springdale, so he kind of glances over his shoulder to make sure as he's changing lanes that, it's safe. So she's the only one that sees it clearly. It comes out from under the underbrush, runs across the road, and disappears onto the other side of the street. She cries out. Will hears her, turns around, and sees it sort of the second half as it's leaving the headlights into the brush. She describes it nearly identical to the two boys the night before, with two major differences that I find really interesting. One is she says that the eyes glowed, but they weren't orange, they were green. The other one is both John and Will specifically say that they see this thing run on two legs. But Abby says it's on all fours when it goes across the road. So we don't really know what we're looking at here. And as far as we know, Dover pretty much disappears from the record at this point. Now, Bill Bartlett says that about a year later, he goes out with his girlfriend. They are sitting in a dark parking lot. I leave the rest up to your imagination. But something hits the top of the car with a mighty crash, and they both freak out. They think maybe a branch has come down on top of the car. So they jump out to have a look, and not only is there no branch, there's not even a dent. And according to Bill, this was big enough that it should have left a scratch, a mark, a dent, something. They were really nervous, in fact, about it, because it was his dad's car. Now, they're kind of looking around, trying to figure out what's going on. And he said, It wasn't quite fully dark, but it was almost completely dark. The sun had gone down. And you could see kind of back from where they were parked, there's a long stretch of trees. And he sees something small and pale kind of moving away from them in the back of the trees. Now, there's a lot of tree cover between him and it. And even to this day, the few times that Bill, as an adult, he has to be, I mean, this is 77, I'm 48, he was 17 at the time. So he's got to be in his 60s at this point. And he doesn't do a lot of interviews about this anymore, but occasionally he will. And he always says, when he brings up this part of the story, I am not saying that this is the same thing. I can't say that because I didn't see it that clearly. All I saw was something that seemed the same size, appeared to be the same color, and appeared to move the same way. But I don't actually know. So I add that as maybe a 0.5. It's not quite a full report, but Bill seems to think there's a chance that it was the same thing. And then Dover disappears. We have no other reports on record that I know of. Like I said, I even drove the whole street last night seeing if something would run out in front of my car. So who knows? There's a lot of interesting theories. We got the really out there stuff. It's an alien, it's a trans-dimensional creature. Some people even say they think it's a fairy because the area has a long-standing history of some really weird folklore. Back in the 1700s, there was supposed to be a rock in town that like you could see fairy lights around, but if you touched it, it would kill you. There's also a story about the devil, believe it or not, riding through not just Dover, but several towns in the area on a dark night in the early 1800s, not only on a flaming horse that a bunch of people claim they saw, but leaving sooty footprints behind, hoofprints of his horse as he rode through the area. So the area definitely has a long-standing history of some weird stuff. There's also some pretty interesting sort of logical explanations or skeptical explanations. I'm not sure I buy it only because of the whole, like, we're pretty sure it ran on 2 legs, but there's a fairly compelling one that says they think it might be a baby moose. I wasn't kidding about the moose thing earlier. So there's a lot of theories about what these kids might have seen, honestly. And we don't know, but you got to admit it's a good story. And it's an interesting little creature. Now, as I said before, we really don't know what Dover is, but you got to admit he does kind of look a little bit like an alien. And so we're going to get into UFOs through Dover. UFOs, of course, are a phenomenon that happen all over the world. And a lot of UFO sightings are interesting, but not particularly exciting. It's a lot of, I saw some lights in the sky, I don't know. Or occasionally it's, you know, a physical object, a black triangle or a disc or something along that line. But most of the time, that's about what you get in most sightings. However, I want to talk about 2 cases in the late 60s and early 70s that kind of put Massachusetts on the map for a while on the international UFO discussion stage, if you will. And I'm going to blame 2 people that had nothing to do with Massachusetts and had their case about 10 years before both of these. I know you know where I'm going with this. Betty Andreasen, this was more maybe like 7 years before this. So an event happens in the early 60s in New Hampshire. A couple named Betty and Barney Hill claimed that they were taken on board a ship and had a bunch of different experiences. And for whatever reason, this catches the world by storm. Everybody's interested in this case. Life magazine carries them, Time magazine carries them, multiple books are written about them. If you ever want to have a really fun night in, see if you can find this on any of your streaming services. If you want to see one of James Earl Jones's very first roles, you can watch him in the made-for-TV movie based on the book. He gets to play Barney Hill. And he's awesome in it. Of course, it's James Earl Jones. He's awesome in everything, but he's great in this. So this case leaves the world, and particularly New England, very hungry for more. And I think they're the ones that kind of set up why these 2 cases really take people's imaginations. And the very first one, in 1967, is the Andreasen affair. Betty Andreasen is a housewife. She lives in South Ashburnham. I always forget that one, excuse me. And did I say that wrong? Oh, how is it? It is Ashburnham? Okay, cool. Every once in a while, you know Massachusetts town names, right? I'll say something and someone will be like, no, it's this. And I'm like, that is not how that's spelled, sir. It's good to be dyslexic, what can I say? So 1967, Betty claims that she has an abduction experience. It starts fairly simple. It ends up getting more complicated under hypnosis. Now, I would be a terrible librarian if I didn't mention that hypnotic regression in these cases is highly controversial. I'm not going to get into that because, again, that's not what we're here to do tonight, but it's an interesting topic and I highly recommend looking it up and seeing some of the different opinions about using that in these cases. But we're going to go with it because it's what happened. So Betty claims on a January night in 1967, she's taken from her home. Now, it's not surprising that this is still debated today, right? All of these cases are always debated today. What's interesting is that Betty's own family members, who she claims were part of this experience, some of them think that she's completely hoaxing this thing in order to make some money on books. Some of them think she's not mentally well and she hallucinated all of this. And some of them are like, no, this absolutely happened. I have the same memories. All in her family, never mind outside in the bigger world. So that alone is really interesting about this case. The other thing that I find kind of unique about this is that Betty Anderson was an evangelical Christian. And it really colored a lot of how she thought about the world. She had very, very strong beliefs. And a lot of what happens to her, she looks at from a biblical perspective. She does not ever call these aliens. She calls them angels. So there's a lot of discussion about how much that had to do with what we later find out she claims happened to her. Is it that something strange happened to her and she filtered it through this idea of the way she saw the world? Is it that these beings are real and they could read her mind and go, this is her belief system, we're going to play into it in order to communicate more effectively? Is it, in fact, they are angels? It's exactly what she thought. Or is it that some evangelicals will say that this entire thing is demons and devils that were trying to take Betty away from the truth in the Bible? You can find cases for all of these. And of course, maybe she made all this up. We don't know. So it's a fascinating case from that perspective. This doesn't really come up very much. And there's some moments that have to do with this. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Betty was also a prolific artist. So a lot of what she claims happened, she actually drew. So most of what you're going to see here in the next couple of slides, she drew herself. She claims that in 1967, she's making dinner with her family. It's January, and they start seeing these flashes of light outside. And she thinks at first it's heat lightning. So she goes over to the window and kind of leans in to see if she can see what's going on. And when she leans back, she realizes that her entire family, including her small children, are in suspended animation. They seem to be frozen in time. And then she hears a strange noise and she turns and she sees these small creatures come through her front door. And when I say come through her front door, I mean they didn't open the door and walk in. They came through the front door, according to her. They literally phase through the wood as if they're ghosts and then become solid when they come onto the other side. She draws two different groups that were part of this original, let's call them a contact party. They mostly looked the same, but half of them had these sort of giant eyes we expect in UFO cases, but with big pupils. The other half had the full black eyes that some of us are familiar with from the X-Files and other things like that. She claims that they had a very pleasant conversation. They talked to her telepathically, according to her, that they gave her a small blue book with very thin pages that had symbols drawn throughout the whole thing, told her that she could look at it for the next few days, but that in a few days it would disappear because they didn't want to leave anything behind that would let people know that they were there. She claims she gave them a Bible and told them it was the most important book that we had on our planet. And then at first she thinks that they just left. That was the exchange. And then suddenly her family is moving around and they have no memory of any of this. Much, much later under hypnosis, she claims that there was actually an entire abduction portion of this that she had forgotten, that they take her onto a ship, that they give her a basic medical examination. My favorite part of this, because it's just so odd, is that she talks about being put on this round bed or table and being examined, and then this giant lens comes down over her, and all of these different colors of light come through the lens separately, and her impression is that these are all different scans. So she's getting different tests with each different color of light. I guess you could think of it as like blue would be an X-ray, green might be a CAT scan, that kind of thing. I've never heard of this before. This is the only case that I've ever seen this. And Betty goes on to claim that this happens to her on a regular basis. Raymond Fowler, who's a big deal at this time period for investigating UFO reports, writes, I think, 4 books about this case, definitely 3, but I believe it's 4. And she talks about all different kinds of things. At one point, she claims to come in contact with these beings of different sizes that seem to have no features whatsoever. She almost compares them to mannequins. They seem to be alive, but she's also kind of under the impression they might be like robots or something like that. She comes in contact with other beings later on that are like these ginormous human people. They look human, except they're towering over her. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, long white robes. She calls them archangels. There's an interesting part to this that in 67 or the early 60s, you don't see a lot of this in America, but there's some UFO cases that become famous later on from Europe where there are people that report this kind of being, even more so than the little gray guys we're used to. Eventually, when people that look into this kind of thing start giving these different groups names just for easy identification, they start calling these guys the Nordics because they sort of look like what you'd expect giant Norse gods to look like, right? Think of an 8-foot Chris Helmsworth. This is kind of what we're talking about. So it's interesting that Betty is one of the first American cases that we actually see this. One of the last things I want to talk about quick is she has an experience where she says she's put into a glass chair. There's a breathing apparatus that's put over her. This kind of top comes down to seal it off, and it's filled with this warm, not water. She said it was thicker than water, but this sort of liquid that's kind of keeping her suspended. And after this is all over, it's drained out, they dry her off, and when she asks, why did you do that? They said, oh, we've taken you to our home. You can come out with us and see where we live. But if you had not been in that device, your body would have absolutely failed to work because the pressures and the speed, your human body just can't deal with that. We had to put you in a protective chamber so you would survive the journey. Again, I've never heard of that before. There is one place, however, that I've gotten something similar. I won't go into it here, but if you want to hear about it, come up and talk to me afterwards. The last thing I want to talk about her case is she also talks about learning a star language. And this is in the same hypnosis session where she claims that these beings brought her to a place on their planet level of being. She didn't really know where she was. She just said it's where they're from. She goes through what appears to be a gate made of glass and speaks to a presence that she sees as a giant light. She calls it the Father. And then she tells the doctor that is putting her under hypnosis that she cannot tell him what the Father told her because the message is specifically for her, that if he wants to know what the Father has to say, he has to find the Father himself. And that's what she was told. So again, here's some of that religious kind of sounding interpretation. She talks about this star language. She writes this sort of scribble. As far as anyone can tell, this isn't really being able to be matched to anything. But there's an interesting thing about the tapes that were made when she said she was speaking in this star language. One of the things they did was they did send it out to a couple of linguists at a couple of local colleges. And one of them was studying a completely different phenomenon. This is a religious phenomenon. We see this in generally certain groups in America, but it's really all over the world, where people will go into religious ecstasies and speak in what sounds like another language. In America, it's referred to as speaking in tongues. There's other names for it all around the world. And this particular linguist said that while they don't believe this is a language, it didn't seem to be a language, there was a cadence to it that matched what he was listening to people speaking in tongues. So it's possible that what we're talking about here is her sort of going into a religious ecstasy while she's having these experiences. We really don't know. But I found it really interesting. And again, this is one of the very few cases I've seen some of these connections made. 4 books, go read them. There's so much more weird stuff I can't even get into tonight. The other one I want to talk about is the Reed family abductions. This starts in Sheffield, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires in 1966. There's multiple layers to this, but most of it happens, they claim, to Thomas and Matthew Reed, who are 2 young boys that are living with their mom and their grandmother. They live on a house in the middle of Sheffield. Their farmhouse has a fairly large piece of land on it. There's a barn. As you can see in the photo of the 2 boys a couple of years later, there's a lot of woods behind their house. There's even a small lake or a large pond back there. So they're on quite a bit of land. And they claim that in 1966, they start noticing these weird orbs of light floating around their house. So at first, they think their house is haunted. They see these kind of things going through walls and coming in through doors and things like that. But a couple of days later, this phenomenon, they claim, stops. And while the boys are outside playing, a large silver, they refer to it as a turtle shell, but the drawing that I've seen of it looks a little more like what you'd think of as a disc, but they call it a silver turtle shell. It comes down in the backyard right around the same area as our pond here, and what comes out of it are the creatures that you see on the left-hand side here. The boys actually call them ants, not aliens. Yes?
That look a bit like the Dover thing?
You know what? You are by far not the first person that's made that comparison. So yes, so who knows, right? Maybe this is, maybe it's Dover's distant cousin. We don't know. But they say that these beings, and it is kind of interesting, they have sort of a insect-like body, but the head is very much like what we expect an alien to look like. Small nose, tiny mouth, big dark eyes. They claim again that they speak telepathically, that they tell the boys they're not here to hurt them. They just want to talk to them, learn a few things. They bring them on board the ship. The boys say they have a super basic examination. They ask them some questions about their lives. And then they show them pictures. They specifically mention a galaxy with planets and stars sort of rotating in the image that they're being shown, and a willow tree. And they're told that these images are important. To this day, as far as I've been able to see, neither one of these guys has ever said whether they found out why that stuff was supposed to be important. So we really don't know. There's an incident roughly about a year later in 1967 where the boys claim to see lights coming down in the woods before they go to bed. And the mother wakes up about 1 o'clock in the morning to find both the boys are missing. They're not in their beds. They're not in the house. She wakes the grandmother up. They both search the house. They go out to the barn and search that. They turn around to go back in the house. Now, they've just come through the area fairly quickly. And as they go back to go in the house, both of the boys are at the bottom of the driveway that they were there just a few minutes before when they went into the barn. And they're both standing there in their pajamas with no memory of how they got there. Much later on, under hypnosis, they claim that they were taken again and given sort of a little tour and talked to their friends, their friendly ants. But the case that really, or the part of the case that really makes big news is what we refer to as the bridge abduction. You can still go to where this is. In fact, the plaque that you see at the other side is a marker in the park showing where this actually kind of went down. You know what? We've got a half an hour, but I'll tell this super fast because it's kind of funny. We found this by accident with my friend Kimberly, who goes on these adventures with me. And Kim could be a Ghostbuster. She ain't afraid of no ghosts, but boy, do not get her near anything alien. She's terrified of the whole idea. So she also likes covered bridges. So we found this by accident because we're in Shefford, and she goes, oh, there's a cool covered bridge. Can we go look? And I go, yeah. So we park and we get out and we walk across the bridge and I see this weird little, thing and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I don't know that I've ever seen a little piece of art like that. And it's got the spinny disc in the center and it says UFO Park, and on the other side this is the site of the, Reed family abductions. And I'm like, oh, this is why I know Sheffield. It's the Reed family abductions. And Kim's like, we are getting in the car and we're getting out of here now. We're gone. I had literally 5 seconds to take pictures because she didn't want any part of this. So the story goes that the family was coming back from a function. I believe it was a church bingo night. On September 1st in 1969, they're coming back. They're driving from this side of the bridge to this side to come out here. Now, you can no longer drive on this. In fact, the road on the other side no longer exists. It's just the park. But if you come out of here and come straight to about here, it's roughly about 50 feet, give or take, you enter Route 7, which is one of the major routes that goes through the area. So that's what the family's doing. They're heading for Route 7 to go home. And they say that as they come through that side of the bridge, the whole world dissolves into this huge blue-white light. And the car stalls out. And then they all black out. They have no memory of what happens until later. They wake up, they're all in the wrong part of the car. The grandmother's standing outside of the car next to the door. The mother's still in the driver's seat, but she's no longer facing the steering wheel. She's actually facing the back of the seat. And the 2 little boys are curled up in sort of the seat well in the back seat. They're also no longer on this little stretch. They're on Route 7, about maybe 20 feet up the road, pulled over to one side, with no memory of how they got there. Now, it's not a huge distance, but it's not something you want to try to drive when you're unconscious. It's just not going to work well. So we don't really know what's going on. And they realize about 2 hours have gone by. They have no memory of what happened in those 2 hours. Much, much later, they start having some memories of seeing, again, the same silver kind of turtle shell saucer-like craft. They talk about being brought through the front of it into a room that they call the airplane hangar because it's so big. They recall being laid on tables and sort of the start of a medical examination, including seeing other people that they didn't recognize on tables around the room going through the same thing. And that's what we have. That's the last report that the Reed family gives us. Now, I also want to mention that during this time period, a couple of days before that September 1st date and a day or two after, there's multiple reports around the area, Great Barrington all the way up to North Adams, of people seeing both blue lights in the sky doing kind of weird maneuvers and also a silver saucer-shaped object. Now, you will find people will claim that this was over 2,000 people making these claims. That is absolutely wrong. It's probably closer to 15. It's a little hard to tell because we do have some records from the local police department because some people did call their local police department to make the reports. But a lot more of them called radio stations instead, and not all of those records are still around. So we're not 100% sure the exact number. The estimate based on what we know is probably somewhere between 15 people. But I don't know where that 2,000 number comes from. I see it online in these reports all the time, and it's blatantly not a good number. Okay, we started with weird creatures, we went to aliens, and now we're going to talk to the dead. Paranormal activity. You can't do a good Halloween party without talking about ghosts and the hauntings that we love. And what else makes a great story but a good haunting, right? Like, these are some of my favorites. And I'd be a terrible librarian if I didn't start at one of my favorite haunted literary places in all of Massachusetts, the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts. The Mount, now I'm going to put my tourist cap on for a second. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it doesn't matter. First of all, the Mount does the best historical tour in Western Massachusetts, in my opinion. Second of all, it's just gorgeous. You can go up and walk around in the summer, and the whole place is just absolutely stunning.
Do you mean the historical tour or the ghost tour?
Well, I'm going to get to that. Okay. So the historical tour is awesome.
Okay.
But between July and October, they also do a ghost tour, I think roughly around 8 o'clock at night, that is also supposed to be really fun. I was supposed to go on one a couple years ago, and then our tour got canceled at the end of the season, so we have not been able to reschedule yet. But, so to understand where some of the ghost stuff comes from, we understand that author Edith Wharton builds the house in 1902. She lives there until 1911. But the house was actually used for a number of different purposes. The two big ones that I want to bring up, because it directly has to do with what people report, is in the 1940s, it was a girls' school. And in the 1970s and early 80s, it was the home of the local Shakespeare and Company, which is a huge Shakespeare group that performed up in the area. Now, not surprisingly, it's supposed to be haunted. One of the big things that happens is people report hearing footsteps all over the house that don't seem to be attached to anything. And one of my favorite examples of this is during the Shakespeare and Company days in the early 80s, we have a director that reported that he was using one of the rooms on the second floor for his office. So he's in there, he's preparing whatever he needs to prepare for the next day's rehearsal. He's got the door closed, so he's got some privacy, and he can hear somebody pacing up and down in front of his door. And he's getting irritated. He can hear the click of the shoes, the weight of the feet, and what he thinks is one of his actors or someone that he works with is out there pacing back and forth, trying to get the courage to knock on the door and maybe give him bad news or tell him the actress is sick or whatever. So finally, he loses his temper. He's like, just open the door and tell me what you need to tell me or go away, I'm working. So finally, he's like, I've had enough. He opens the door and goes, what? And there's nobody there. So he closes the door, goes back to work, and 20 minutes later, tap, 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 tap. This happens a couple of times. So the next night, he loses his temper again and decides, that's it, I'm leaving the door open. If somebody does this again, I'll immediately sue who it was before they can hide. He thinks they're pranking him. So he gets to his desk and he starts working, and he hears click, 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 click as they're going up the hall, and he spins around in his chair as it hits the front of the door, and there's nobody there. But he hears the footsteps go by when no one is there. He gets all of his stuff, goes downstairs, and is like, yeah, I'm taking a new office. We're not doing this anymore. Now, Edith herself is sometimes seen on the grounds, and we're going to get to my favorite story from the Mount that deals with that. But she's often seen up on the second floor, occasionally seen out in the yards and the gardens. Much like a few other historical places we'll talk about later, it's often that tourists will think she's a guide because in certain times of the year they'll do fully costumed guidance. And then when they approach her, she'll disappear. There's also a young girl that's sometimes reported being seen up on the third floor, and no one really knows who she is. She's supposed to look about 11 or 12. She's definitely dressed from the same time period. It's thought that she might either be one of the youngest servants in the house. They did employ kids that were 13, 14, or she might be the daughter of one of the servants that were living in the house at the time, but nobody really knows. We also have the Henry James room, which is kind of the library in the building. And we often get reports of people hearing a typewriter in the room. Now, this is one of the rooms that Edith Wharton used to write in, but there are no typewriters in the area, so we're not really sure what that's all about. There's also, both in the Henry James room and in several other rooms in the house, people will report hearing girls sort of giggling and whispering and sort of, they can never quite tell what they're saying, but it just sounds like a couple of like 12, 13-year-old girls having a good time. And it's thought that that might reflect some of the girls that were in the house in the 40s when it was a girls' school. Although I would like to note that as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing on record that any of these kids died in the house. So either it's not them, or maybe they love the house so much, they loved being at that school so much they've come back. Who knows? But that's one of the big ones. Having said that, let me tell you my favorite story about Edith Wharton herself showing up. There was an actor, Andrea Herring, and she told this story for years. She's reported in multiple articles repeating this. And she is staying in the house in 1979. She is part of Shakespeare and Company. And she goes to have her rehearsal for the day. It is July. It is stupidly hot. They are all not feeling spectacular after the rehearsal is over. A couple of people have headaches, a little bit of nausea when you get those bad heat headaches. And she decides that she wants to take a nap to try to make herself feel better. So she goes into Edith Wharton's bedroom and lies down on the bed that's in the room. She lies down on top of the covers because it's so hot and opens the window in the room in order to get some airflow going. And she said it was very pleasant. She falls asleep listening to birdsong. You know, it's in the evening, but it's summer, so it's still pretty light out. And at some point in the future, she does not know how long she was asleep, she wakes up because the room is cold. It's cold enough that she's uncomfortable. And when she opens her eyes and she's looking at the ceiling, she realizes that there's something else wrong. She described it as almost like looking at the room through a filter. It was still the room, there was still color, but all the color was muted. It didn't look sharp the way it should. And then, so she's feeling better, she doesn't have a headache anymore, but she's kind of afraid something's happening to her. So she goes to roll over and kind of sit up and try to see if she can figure out what's going on. And as she rolls over, she freezes because there's 3 people in the room with her. There's a woman who's reclining on the sofa on the other side, on one of those little Victorian-style sofas. There's another woman who's sitting at the writing desk adjacent to that same sofa. And there's a man who's standing against the wall, right near the sofa, with one leg up on there, kind of like, hey, how's it going? Doing a little bit of a you know, suave kind of look there. She recognizes 2 of them right away because their pictures are all over the house. The woman on the sofa is Edith Wharton. The man leaning up against the wall is Edward Wharton, her husband. And she's been looking at their picture all summer. To this day, I have never seen her identify the 3rd woman. She did not know who that was. But the woman at the desk is writing with an old-fashioned fountain pen, and all 3 of them are talking to each other. But the thing is, she can't hear them. She can see them. One of them even laughs as they're talking, but there's literally no sound. It's like watching a silent movie. And then she realizes there's no sound, period. She can't hear the birds outside anymore. She can't hear anything. It's like being in a silent movie. Now she's really frightened. But they don't seem to know she's there. They're talking, and the woman at the desk motions to Edith with a pen, and they laugh. You know, they're having this whole thing. So she thinks, okay, they don't know I'm here. I'm just going to kind of slip out and see if I can get away. So she rolls over, you know, fully, gets up off the bed, and as she stands, all 3 of them stop talking and immediately turn and look at her. And now she's terrified. And she said that they didn't look angry, but they didn't really look friendly either. They just kind of looked like, I'm sorry, and you are? So she did the only thing she could think to do. She kind of gave him a little like, sorry. And she says that Edith, once she does that, Edith kind of gives her a small smile and a little nod, gracious nod of the head as if to say, ah, it's a mistake, of course. And she gets up to leave the room and they go back to their conversation and then it's like she's not there anymore. She leaves the room, and the second she gets in the hallway, it's hot again, the color is fine, and she can hear everything. She gets a few of her fellow actors, she gets a director that's in the building at the time, they go back in the room, and of course, it's all normal and there's nobody else in there. Now, this is where it ends. That's her story. But I've always hoped that before I die, they're going to find a journal that no one's ever read of Edith Wharton's. And they will find an entry in the back of it that's like, August 15th, had the next door neighbor over for a talk. It was lovely. Until some weird lady that was dressed in a way I've never seen suddenly appeared in the room. Apparently the place is haunted. That would just be fabulous. But I can't end the story that way because that's not actually what happened. So hopefully in the future, something like that. All right, I want to talk for a minute about Salem. I could do an entire talk on Salem all by itself. There's so much weird stuff going on up there. But what we're going to talk about is the Joshua Ward House, and that's mostly because of the photograph, the very famous photograph that was taken in there. Now, to talk about the Joshua Ward House, we have to talk a little bit about its history. The Joshua Ward House was not always there. There was a different house on that property during the Salem witch trials. And the house that was on that property was one of the homes that was owned by Sheriff George Corwin, and part of it was used as a jail for people in town, including people that were accused of witchcraft. Now, if you know anything about George Corwin, if you've ever studied the Salem witch trials, this guy was particularly brutal even by the standards of his day. There were a lot of people in both Salem town and Salem city that absolutely hated him, to the point that when he died in 1697, roughly about 4 years or so after the Salem witch trials were over. He was pretty young too, by the way. He was, I believe, 35, so the heart attack was kind of odd. The family did not bury him right away, both because it was winter and it was hard to bury people, but also because they were afraid that people in town might dig up his corpse and desecrate it because they hated him that much. Does anyone know the story of Giles Corey? Okay, I see some nods, I see some shakes, so we'll do the story quickly, but this is a really good example of how cruel this guy could be. Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft. If you go to the memorial up there, you will see him listed. He is the only person that was not hanged for witchcraft, and officially he wasn't executed, although I argue the fact that basically, yes, he was. It just wasn't legally executed. He refused to confess one way or the other when he was accused, and you could not go to trial without a confession. So in all of his creative genius, and I say that in the most bitter way possible, George Corwin decides they're going to lay this 70-something-year-old man in the middle of town, put a board over him, and start stacking rocks on top of him, and constantly ask him every time they put a rock on him, do you confess one way or the other? And he refused. According to the record, he lasted about a day and a half before he finally gave in to his injuries. There is a legend that says that the last thing he said was more weight, but we don't actually have that on record, so we're not sure. That illustrates to you exactly the kind of guy we're talking about here. So that house eventually burns down in the early 1700s. The Joshua Ward House is built on it. And then the Joshua Ward House has been a number of different things. It was a private residence for many years. In the 1700s itself, it was an inn and tavern. It has been a real estate office in the early 80s. We'll talk about that in a second. It's also been a law office. Currently, if you are very curious about all of this, you can stay there because they just made it a hotel a couple of years ago. I'm going to tell you something. We will find out in a minute what kind of person I am, but I'm not staying there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And some of the activity of the house, not surprisingly, kind of goes along with all of this. So they talk about the fact that when they were still using candles for light, that candles didn't last more than a day or two in the house. They would just melt spontaneously, even in the winter when that should not have happened. happened. There's a lot of problems with the electrical system over the year, and not surprising, there are some not quite as benign reports. For example, some people have said that they feel like they're being strangled either by an unseen pair of hands or sometimes by what feels like a piece of rope, and strangulation was one of Corvin's favorite ways to get people to try to confess when he was torturing them. There are other reports where people say they felt like they've been slapped or punched, even hard enough that they have bruising, and occasionally the report of being scratched hard enough to draw blood. And then we have our case in 1981. In 1981, this place is a real estate office. And it's around the Christmas season, and they decide what they're going to do is they're going to photograph all their employees and put them on a wreath in the front door to welcome everybody in. So they start taking photos. And one of the very last people to get photographed is our young friend right here, Julia Tremblay. And Julia is wearing a very festive sweater. They photograph her from the waist up for the picture. And what comes out of the Polaroid camera is our friend right here. Now, I'm going to put a tiny skeptic hat on because I do like to try to play fair. While it does appear that this person, entity, something, has a wild mane of hair, it is also possible that what we are seeing is a Christmas wreath behind this person's head. Because you do have to admit it does kind of look like that. Even beside that, though, that doesn't look anything like the outfit that Julia says she was wearing. And once you look at it for a minute, you realize that both the face and the hands have a very skeletal appearance, even as blurred as they are. Now, it is a Polaroid, and as the Black Eyed Peas like to say, you shake it like a Polaroid picture. So if you were one of those people that was really impatient and liked to do that, you could sometimes mess the picture up. You blurred it a little or you did something. But that's a pretty exact blur for what we're talking about here. So it's weird. We really don't know what it's all about. But that's the most famous picture that's ever been taken in the house. As I say, if any of you are brave, you can stay there the night. And if you do, please contact me and tell me what you saw, because I ain't going anywhere near wherever that thing came out of. Sorry. And this is coming from a woman that will gladly stay at the Lizzie Borden house. Lizzie Borden in Falls Rivers, Massachusetts, of course, is one of the most famous murder cases in Massachusetts, and also a supposedly extremely haunted house. Now, we all know the rhyme, right? All right. Took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks, and when she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Excellent. Okay. Good, because not everybody knows that one anymore. It's kind of a bummer. We used to do that jumping rope, of all things, so it was the 80s. What can I say? It was a weird time. So the famous rhyme gets a couple of things wrong about the actual case. There wasn't that many, absolutely. So we actually don't know what the murder weapon was. It probably wasn't an axe because the way the murders were done, you wouldn't have enough room to swing an actual axe. It probably was a handheld hatchet, but we don't actually even know that. That was an assumption made by the coroner when he looked at the injuries, but they never actually found the murder weapon, so we don't know. As pointed out, it is not 40 and 41 when they had a look at the wounds. The problem is that they were both attacked in the head and face, and the wounds were so bad they really started to blend together after a certain point. So we're not sure how many times they were struck. But the estimate from the coroner at the time was that Andrew probably was hit 10 to 11 times, and Abby was probably hit somewhere between 17 and 20, which is still pretty horrific, but it's not 40 and 41. The other thing, because I'm surprised Lizzie hasn't manifested and gone, whoa, 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 wait, you're wrong about that, is that it was not her mother, but her stepmother, and she was very, very clear about telling people that Abby was not her mother. Lizzie's mother died when she was almost 3 years old, and Abby was really the only sort of maternal figure, and I'm using this in a loose manner. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole case. If anyone's interested, I actually do a whole lecture on the whole case, so if you're into that, I could come back. But I do want to put a few things up here and cover just a couple of quick things that do have some things to do with the haunting. First of all, one of the reasons that's always brought up that Lizzie maybe killed them is because supposedly she hated her stepmother. Now, they did not have a particular close relationship. They definitely didn't act like mother and daughter. But by most accounts, for pretty much all of her life, they had a cordial relationship, maybe even mildly friendly. So that hate that everyone talks about wasn't really there. Not until a certain thing happened and then it soured the relationship. We won't get into it because it's not important for the ghost part, but if anyone's interested, come talk to me afterwards. If anyone had any reason to be jealous and angry about the fact that Abby had come to live with them, it was probably Emma Borden, who was Lizzie's older sister. Now, she was 10 when their mom died, and the mom had basically said to her before she died, you need to take care of your sister, you're the mom now. And when Abby came along, she did not like that. There's also this idea that Andrew was very tight-fisted, which he could be, but he could also be really generous. So he was a very complicated man. But that did make him unpopular with some people in town, and the family gets super, super sick on August 2nd, 1892, a couple of days before the murders actually happened. And while the family doctor was like, oh, you got food poisoning, there's a little debate about what they actually ate. It was either mutton or swordfish, but it was the height of August. It was very hot, and they basically left it on the stove for far too long. But Abby did not believe the doctor. She thought someone had snuck in the house and poisoned their milk or poisoned their food to try to kill the family. That comes up in the trial as a possible alternative suspect. There's also the fact that the year before, the family home was robbed, and Andrew starts locking doors even when people are in the house. So they had to start carrying keys in order to access different rooms of the house. There's a lot of other interesting things. You can read some of this here. I'm not going to get heavily into it because we're running out of time, but it's a much more complicated case than most people think. The very overview of the case is on August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden is killed in his parlor. Abby Borden is killed up on the second floor in an upstairs bedroom that was like a guest room. After they have a look at the coronary report, they discovered that actually Abby was definitely killed first and Andrew was killed second. There's a whole thing. On August 11th, Lizzie is formally arrested, formally charged with the murders. A year later, on June 5th, her trial begins, and on June 20th of that same year, she is found innocent. Most people don't know that. A lot of people assume she was found guilty. Very, very quickly, the reason that we have so much trouble, yes?
Oh, the interesting thing I think I heard was it was an all-male jury, of course, and they
Yes.
said, of course, no woman could ever be that.
That is part of it, for sure. There is also the fact that the crime scene was very contaminated. There were multiple neighbors, multiple family members that once the alarm was roused were in the house before the cops ever showed up. So definitely had not a clean crime scene, if you'll look at it that way. There's also the problem that Lizzie had a lot of testimony that she would tell the police one thing and then a couple of days later tell them something entirely different that made no sense. And a lot of people were like, she's lying. Maybe she was. But we know for a fact she was also stoned out of her mind on morphine. The family doctor continually gave her morphine for about 11 to 12 days after the murder in order to calm her nerves. And we don't know how much of that testimony is lying, or if any of it's lying, and how much of it is that she is just absolutely out of her mind and can't remember what she said 20 minutes ago, never mind what she saw a couple of days ago. So this is a very confusing case. And confusing cases and violent cases often lead to rumors of hauntings. Now, one of the rooms in the attic where Bridget's room, Bridget Sullivan is the maid. During the murder of the stepmother, Bridget was outside washing windows with several neighbors, and another local servant saw her in the backyard. So she was pretty much immediately removed as a suspect because they're like, there's no way she could have done. Sure. And she was also seen in the yard walking through during when, most likely when Andrew was killed. But in her room up on the top floor, there's an area that people claim to hear children laughing in the middle of the night. They will see objects moving around. There's a rocking chair that moves, and people leave toys there. Dolls, stuffed animals, balls, things like this. And they will say they see these toys moved around or sometimes see them moving around. And nobody really knows who these children might be, particularly because there never really were any children in the house once this happened. Emma and Lizzie are pretty much the only children, and by the time this happens, they're in their 30s. They never marry, they never have their own children, but something happens next door about 50 years before all of this that makes that possibility of having a connection. Lizzie's great aunt in 1848, in a fit of what almost certainly was postpartum psychosis, she'd had a long history of problems, kills 2 of her young children in the basement of the house next door, and then kills herself. Her oldest child gets away to get help, but it's too late. And there's some speculation that if these are in fact children, that maybe they were attracted to the house next door because there's more attention and there's more energy there. Who knows? The room that Abby was killed in, you can sleep in. I may do this someday. The only crime scene photo I'm going to show you is this one because it's important to the story. This is, in fact, the crime scene photo with Abby. And people will hear thudding sometimes in the middle of the night or other noises. This happens a couple of years ago. The wife jumps out of bed, runs around after they turn the light on, takes this photo. And the entire room is furnished with replicas that are from the looking like the original house. So what we should be seeing is that same dresser, but what we are seeing is what appears to be this kind of white misty effect. We don't know what that is, but they seem to suggest that there's something strange going on. There's also quite a few other cases. We're actually falling a little bit behind, so I want to kind of, are we open till 8? Okay, cool. I know you guys need dinner, so I don't want to hold you for too long. But a lot of what you get reported is kind of what you expect in a haunted house. Footsteps, voices in rooms. Those keys I talked about earlier, a lot of people, particularly in the Abby Borden room, if you're staying there, the stairwell is right there in front. There's actually part of the case that has to do with that. But people will report hearing people on the stairs with what sounds like a large ring of keys jingling, and they can't see anybody. People will come to check in or to take the tour and see a woman in Victorian dress walking across the backyard, which now is the gift shop, but used to be the barn, with 2 buckets, and they assume that it's one of the guides because they all dress in that period. In fact, a couple of them dress as Bridget. And as they approach, she will disappear, and the thought is that that is Bridget Bishop taking her buckets to go wash the back windows. And then we have a really interesting report from the late 2000 teens from a reporter from 94.9 WHOM, one of the local radio stations, who was doing a special kind of Halloween, it's Lizzie Borden kind of thing. And in between the segments that they were recording, she was standing in the downstairs parlor talking to her 2 colleagues who were helping her do the report. And while she turned to look at one of them, realized that she could see all 3 of their shadows against the back wall, and there was a 4th shadow that shouldn't have been there, that appeared to be a woman in a long dress with a bun. And when she turned to point this out to them, they all looked and it had disappeared in those few seconds. There's also a weird history of phantom cats in the house. This is Max, who really was a real cat for a while. He may still be there, we're not sure. But even as far back as the 80s and early 90s, before it was a bed and breakfast, we had people that were working in the house or doing various things in the house who claimed that they felt cats sort of twining around their ankles for affection, and they'd look down and there'd be nothing there. Once it became a bed and breakfast, people started reporting that they would wake up in the middle of the night in their beds and feel what appeared to feel like a cat sleeping on their knees or on their ankles. And when they turn the light on, the weight disappears and there's nobody there. Max was actually the bed and breakfast cat up until 2021, where he passed away at the ripe old age of 21 himself. So he did good. That's old for a cat. And still we have people that either know Max was there but don't realize he's gone, or don't know that he was there in the first place, who will approach their hosts and say, oh, I was in the gift shop getting my tickets and I saw your cat. He's so cute. It's so funny that you have a black cat in a haunted house. And they're like, we don't have any cats on the property right now. So who knows? Max may still be around kind of doing his job. Now, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that I toured this house in June and something very strange happened to us. Our tour guide takes us through the house. And the way they start is they start on the first floor with the actual murders, because you are adjacent to the parlor that Mr. Borden is found in. And then they walk you through the house to the second floor, where they continue to talk about the murders. They talk about some of the family history, and then they start to get into some of the early stuff that leads to the trial. And when you get up to the third floor, where the servants' quarters were, that's when they really get into the meat potatoes of the trial. So we're standing in the hallway on the third floor, and as you can see, this hallway has a beautiful thick carpet, and we're having a discussion, and my friends and I are on one wall, kind of sitting on a sofa that's there. There's many people with us, and there's a mother who's come with her 2 teenage kids to take the tour, and she's standing on the other side against the wall you know, a good maybe 6 inches, give or take a little. And our guide starts talking about Judge Dewey, who's one of the judges in the trial. And there was a huge controversy about him being on the trial. We won't get into it because it's not important, but it's fascinating. So she's talking about what the controversy with the, Judge Dewey is. And all of a sudden, the mother of this family kind of goes, "Oh!" And we all look at her and go, "What?" And she's like, "Someone threw something into my back," which doesn't make any sense because she's basically standing against a wall. So we look, and this is on the floor. Now, there's a couple of interesting things. She did not say something fell off the wall and hit my back. She says, that did not fall, that hit me. It hit me hard enough to hurt. So we don't know what that's all about. Again, we are talking about a very thick carpet. So when we look down, the picture frame is in pieces, but you will notice what is not in pieces, it's not even cracked. The glass. If anything was going to break, it should be the glass first. It is not. The rug is very thick. I do not know how falling off the wall would break a frame like this. It should have just been cushioned enough to be okay. And after the guide picks it up and puts it on the table and starts taking everyone downstairs, because you know I had to, I'm like, "Shh, I'll be down in a second. Let me have a look." So I take a quick picture, and then I start looking at the pieces. And as far as I can tell, I'm not an expert, but as far as I can tell, it appears that this frame is not, in fact, broken. I don't see anything that looks like something snapped. What it looks like, you can even see some of the nails, is it appears that someone pulled it apart. The only actual damage I could see is where the nails go in. You can see it shredded a little bit, like there was a lot of force to pull it out. Other than that, I could have put that frame back together, put a little glue on it, and been fine. So I don't know what this was all about, but it was very weird, and I was a little shaken up, I have to admit. So who knows? We might have had a ghost encounter. Okay, the last story I want to share with you guys tonight comes from our area, Half-Hanged Mary. Hadley, Massachusetts. This is partially a maybe history, maybe folklore, it's a little hard to tell, and partially a ghost story. This story, we know the original source of this is a pamphlet called Memorable Provinces Relating to Witchcraft from 1689. We know about this pamphlet because it's written by a guy named Cotton Mather. And if you know anything about the Salem witch trials, you'll recognize that name. He is a minister who kind of becomes New England's witchfinder general. He writes a ton about how to find and take care of witches if they are in your village. He tells this story in the pamphlet. Now, historians have had a lot of trouble kind of trying to go back and find anything past that pamphlet. There's books that come out later that repeat this story. So we don't really know if Mary was real. We don't really know if he made Mary up. And we don't really know if Mary was real, but Cotton Mather exaggerated the story because we know for a fact he's done that with other things. Sometimes he made stuff up completely from cloth just to make a point. Sometimes he took a real story but added his own thing to it. But because the ghost story is attached to it, we're going to tell it as history. But again, I'd be a bad librarian if I didn't mention that there's a little controversy there. So the story starts in 1683. We have this local woman, her name is Mary Webster, and Mary lives in Hadley, Massachusetts. And Mary is everything you don't want to be if you live in Puritan New England and you don't want to be accused of witchcraft. First of all, she's an older woman. Second of all, she's very poor. She basically makes her living begging or occasionally doing odd jobs. Third, from the description, she drinks a lot. She might be considered a functional alcoholic in our society. And fourth, she's the kind of person who absolutely, if she likes you, will absolutely let you know. She'll be your best friend and do the kindest things in the world for you. But if she doesn't like you, you're going to know about it. And she's the kind of person that will curse you and spit at your feet and say horrible things to you. All the stuff you're not supposed to do as a good Puritan woman. So the town really doesn't like her, mostly. There's some people that do, that she's kind to. And then the rumors start. It's all things like, Mary asked me for milk and I said no, and now my cow is giving milk with blood in it, or my kid, crashed into her in the street and now he has scarlet fever. You get the idea. So she's arrested in 1683 for witchcraft. She's brought to Northampton to be put on trial. And I really have to apologize. I don't know how else to put this. It's a hung jury. They don't know if she's a witch or not. So then they send her to Boston, and they put her on trial in Boston the same year. And something kind of amazing happens, particularly for this time period. She's actually found innocent in court in Boston, and she's sent home. So some people in Hadley are not really happy about this. And there's a gentleman that's living in town, Philip Smith, who is everything you do want to be if you want to have a good life in Puritan society. He's a very wealthy man. He's a church father. He's very respected by his neighbors. Everyone in town really looks up to him. And he and Mary have been having a feud for a while now. No one really knows where it started. She probably asked him for money or something, and he probably said no. But in January of 1685, this comes to a head. They have a conflict in the middle of the city, and a lot of people witness it. Mary loses her temper, yells at some things at him, spits at his feet, this sort of thing, and then stomps off. And a couple of days later, according to Cotton Mather, Philip Smith gets really, really sick. By some of the description, it almost sounds like tuberculosis. They talk about him coughing up blood. But then some of it sounds like more of a gastro thing. And some of it sounds like an allergic reaction. They claim that parts of his body swell up so big they can't even get him properly onto a bed. So it's really hard to tell what exactly is going on here. And then he talks about the really out there stuff like scratching appearing on his body with no reason, a phantom cat that apparently is howling in the room and keeping him from getting sleep to try to get better, and a shadow that looms over his bed the entire time people are trying to take care of him. So obviously the assumption is Mary the witch has put a curse on him. She's sending her spirit out to torment him. What are we going to do? She's already been put on trial. She's been found innocent. There's no way to put her back on trial again. So they don't. They just go out to her shack, which probably was along the very beginning of Route 9 at the edge of town. They drag her out in the middle of winter. They throw a rope around her neck and they hang her. And then they dig a shallow grave in the very, very frozen ground and bury her and go back into town with a job well done, and Philip will be saved. Well, two things happen according to Cotton. One is Philip is not saved. He dies terribly a couple of days later. In fact, it's described that his body is so swollen and so distended that two people have to sit on his coffin while they nail it down because he no longer fits properly in it. Yeah, it's pretty nasty. The second thing is Mary isn't actually dead. Whoever was in charge of checking that didn't do their job. She is very badly hurt, but she wakes up in the shallow grave, digs herself out, drags herself back to her shack, and lays low for about a month while she heals up. And then she shows up to the middle of Hadley. Whoa. Hello. And according to Cotton Mather, I'm going to put a slightly 20th century spin on this, but consider it my interpretation of Puritan story. She is like, yo, here I am. You're going to give me that bag of gold that's underneath your bed. You're going to give me that cow that I wanted last week. I want 3 of your chickens. I like you. Don't worry about it. And I'm going to take your husband. And according to the story, everyone in Hadley is like, yes, ma'am, what else can we get for you? For the rest of her life, the town is terrified of the witch that cannot be killed. And according to the story, about 25 years later, give or take a little, she dies peacefully in her sleep in her mid-90s. A very different woman than when she started. Now, Cotton Mather tells the story as a tragedy. The witch gets away with it. I have a very different opinion about where this story goes. But here's the ghost story part. We don't really know where her shack was, but the way that Hadley is laid out, it's probably would have been somewhere where sort of the beginning of Hadley starts right after you get off the bridge from Northampton, because there's a lot of farmland and stuff that's still kind of there. And that's where a lot of that area was at the time. So, according to stories that I started seeing they started getting reported roughly around the mid-'80s, but they might go back further, it's hard to tell. People were saying that along that stretch of Route 9, there's plenty of places to pull over, and there, in fact, used to be even more. You'd pull over and find some picnic tables, you could have lunch with your family, or an ice cream stand, or a Cumberland Farms with a gas station and, kind of a convenience store attached. And people would talk about the fact that they'd get themselves settled or be doing something, and a woman would show up, and she's an older woman, and she's usually dressed in a dark dress of black or dark blue and a shawl, and not so weirdly dressed that you immediately are like, this is wrong, this person's not supposed to look like this, but weird enough that you're a little bit like, this is a little strange. And supposedly she will approach people and say, excuse me, ma'am, I'm having a bit of a bad day. Would you be able to maybe foot me a cup of coffee? That would be really nice. Or could I please have an ice cream cone? Or I see you're having a picnic. May I have half a sandwich? I haven't eaten today. And according to the story, if you say yes and you give her half a sandwich or whatever, that within a few days, something lovely will happen to you. You get out of the car at work, you find a $20 bill in the parking lot, or something along that line. And if you're the kind of person that goes, lady, get a job, you're a loser, you get back in your car and then 10 feet up the road, your tire pops. It's never catastrophic. It's never so wonderful it changes your life altogether, but it's this idea of like, depending on how you treat her, you get taken away, one or the other. Now, I cannot say for a fact I know this story to be true, but I did not know this story until about 3 or 4 years ago when I incorporated it into this presentation. And many years before that, around 2013, my wonderful friend Kim, who's also of the get out of here, I don't want to be on the covered bridge with the aliens, we often go on Sunday drives, which is how we found that park. And we are driving in Hadley, and we stop at the Cumberland Farms, that's right there with the gas station, and we go in to get sandwiches and gas and a couple of cups of coffee. And around the corner steps an older woman in a dark dress and a shawl. And she says to us, I'm having a bit of a trouble. Would you mind, I could use a sandwich or something. And we're like, yeah, of course, because honestly, that's just kind of how we roll. So we go in and we get her a sandwich, and I ask her how she takes her coffee, and we get her a cup of coffee, and while we're leaving, I hand her a couple of bucks because I just happen to have a few bills on me. We have a very short but pleasant conversation, and then I get back in my car and we take off. Now, this is about a week and a half before Christmas. And my Aunt Jane, every year, as a joke, used to get us scratch tickets because we don't buy those for ourselves. And if I do, it's like the $2 ones every once in a while. She'd get us the ones that were like 30 bucks and stick them in an envelope because she just thought it was funny. So about a week and a half later, I'm eating my pumpkin pie and I'm having my cup of coffee and I'm chatting it up with my aunt as I'm scratching and I'm going, ooh, I hit, that's pretty cool. I hit again, holy crap, I think I hit every single one of these. And I scratch everything off and it's a $500 winner. I have never, ever again won that much money, even close, on a scratch ticket. We're talking 10, 20 bucks is like a big win for me. Now, to be fair, I only buy them maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Now, I'm not saying that that was Mary and that because we bought her a sandwich that I got a good scratch ticket. But you have to admit that is a great coincidence to end that story with. So, it might have been. So, I'm going to end with this. My advice to you is, if an old lady steps around the corner and asks you for a cup of coffee, I say yes. Because 2 things are going to be true, one or the other. Either the worst case scenario is this is just a nice old lady that needs a little bit of help, and don't we all just need a little bit of help sometime? We need a little kindness. It's not going to hurt you one bit to do a little bit of kindness for another human being. In fact, it'll make you much better. And then best case scenario, as the Bible says, you may be entertaining angels unaware. You don't know who that person is. It is very much, in fact, perhaps, the ghost of a woman who had the wrong done to her and is now testing you to see what side of that conflict you might have been on had you been there. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. I love telling these stories. They're so much fun. This is my bibliography. If anyone wants to photograph it, like I said, I have my business cards, so you also can grab those if you want a physical copy. And for folks that might be a little savvy, I can also go back and put this back up in a second. This is the QR code for my website and my website. I have multiple bibliographies, including some for those other talks I talked about, the Mothman and all that kind of fun stuff. So you can find more of those books. I do want to do a very quick shout out to the house next door to Lizzie Borden. It is now a coffee shop. This very, very nice family owns it. And when they found out I was going to talk about Lizzie Borden in this presentation, they took me into the basement for free so I could see where those terrible murders happened before, which sounds really kind of grim, and it was, but I give them 2 things. One is they're very respectful when they tell you the history, and 2, they do not charge tourists to go downstairs, but they ask that you make a donation to a local charity wherever you go home to that helps women or mothers with postpartum depression. So I originally did this version in Fall River about a month later, and I told them that I would donate the entire amount that I was getting paid for that to a charity. So I did that when I got home. But they are lovely. So if you're in Fall River, please go by and see them and support their business because they are lovely, lovely people. I'll put that back up. And if people want the bibliography, I'll put that back up. Thank you. You can all go now. Go into the dark. Try not to be afraid. And remember, a cup of coffee. It's really easy, guys.